pleasure to be here. What an incredible show that was. That was really powerful.
So should we talk about our fathers first?
I want to go back to Pamela Anderson.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, it brought so many ideas to mind. One that just kept coming back was this work that was done, I think maybe it was in the 1980s, by a psychologist, Bob Abelson, who explored this metaphor of beliefs as possessions. And I just kind of felt, I kept thinking of that as this was unfolding tonight, that the things that we believe in, we sort of cherish and nurture, and we like to show them to people we think will appreciate it, but some of them are very intimate, and so we only show them to people that are close to us. And some of the people who are closest to us know about some of our most cherished beliefs that others don't know about. Yeah. So I kept seeing the sort of beliefs as possessions as part of the dynamic of what was unfolding here.
Yeah, I mean, I saw so much stuff, so, I just spent 5 years writing a book that's coming out in Random House next September, and the title is actually called Friend and Foe, When to Cooperate, When to Compete, and How to Succeed at Both. And it kept reminding me of this idea that part of the theme of this book is that every relationship we have, with some of our siblings, our spouses, our colleagues at work, like Daniel and I are colleagues at work, we're both friend and foes. So there's this tension between cooperation and competition. And if you think about siblings, right, they're kind of like siblings. They're living together, they're traveling together. We have brotherly love and we have sibling rivalry. And the one thing that we know about our siblings is we know how to push their buttons, right? And you could see how they kept pushing each other's buttons in this way. And just one other just sort of thing, that I talked a little about in this book, and that reminds me of this is, this idea of the importance of comparisons. Everything that was happening on the stage was about comparing to each other, right? And there's a finding that's in the literature that, sometimes twins reared apart are more similar than twins reared together. And that seems perplexing. We have the genetic similarity plus the environmental similarity. Twins reared together should be more similar, but part of what we do when we're together is we try to differentiate ourselves from each other. And you can see so much of this differentiation, like, well, I might have some privilege, but you have more privilege, so I'm going to go in the opposite direction and pretend I have less privilege. And so you can start to see the things that we do that are different. And I actually have a twin brother myself, so I can appreciate that. And my brother was faster than I was when I was in 6th grade or 7th grade. I can't remember when. I ran a 10K in like 46 minutes. And my brother ran it in like 42 minutes, so eventually I ended up wrestling because I had to differentiate myself from my brother. But you can just see this process of comparison and trying to distinguish yourself from each other. And you see this all the time in siblings and competing over how much they make or their spouses make, and you see that. So I kept thinking about the comparison process and that tension that was existing within that sense of, I know you, I cooperate with you, I connect with you, but yet I compete with you, and that forces me to distance myself and differentiate myself.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think relationships work best when it's just equals, but I think there's a good deal of research, some of which is yours, which suggests it's a natural tendency to try to sort ourselves out in different ways, and that sometimes when we find patterns of deference or hierarchy, it actually facilitates relationships, it coordinates action. So it seemed like they were repeatedly seeking ways to sort themselves.
Yeah, that's true. We're trying, when there's tension, right, we can sort that out by one person acting deferential. So they mentioned at one point, acting deferential. There's a famous study done by some researchers at Stanford where they actually had two people sit in chairs, and what they did is they had a Confederate. They told them to sit in different positions. So sometimes the Confederate sat like this, and then the subject would start to expand and dominate. But then if the Confederate did this, the subject could naturally do this. And they found that when the Confederate would do the opposite of what the other person was doing in this dominance hierarchy, they both liked each other better, right? And so there's this sense of trying to find some type of balance within a hierarchy too, right? So.
A lot of what this was as well was conflict, and that makes me think of the research on intimate relationships, close relationships, and conflict. And it goes back decades. That often what is the mark of a good relationship is the ability to handle conflict and to do it in a way that surfaces substantive issues, but does it in a way that contains safety.
Yeah.
Some of the research on intimate relationships, romantic relationships, marital relationships, I think there was an idea many decades ago that good relationships don't have fighting, right? Like happy couples don't fight, I think was one of the original ideas. And John Gottman, I think one of the primary researchers in this tradition decades ago, started off with that idea and started to look at couples and how they dealt with conflict, and found that it wasn't that happy couples didn't fight or happy couples fought a lot, it's how they fought. And that they had ways of, he has lovely ways of describing this, of sort of signaling safety in the midst of a disagreement, whether sometimes it's just a touch or a look or a joke. And you mentioned the sort of intimacy of these two characters in the show tonight, that they knew how to press each other's buttons, but they also knew how to unpress each other's buttons, right? They also knew how to make the biting comment in a way that landed softly.
Except at the end.
Except at the end, kind of went down a little bit.
It's true. And one of the word that John Gottman uses, I think that's so important, the best predictor of sort of marital disillusion over time, or relationship disillusion, is do you express contempt towards the other person? Mm-hmm. And so it's that, the safety versus the contempt, I think that really makes a difference. And I just taught this John Gottman thing about 5 years ago, and I was dating this woman, and about a week after I taught this, we went to see a movie, and I tend to cry at the end of movies, and she ended up expressing contempt a little bit towards my tears, and we broke up on the way home. So I was like, I know we now have a 95% probability of not working out, so we should extend this now. So this is how you use research, is you use it to make decisions in your life. And so, but one other thing that I wanted to think about too, because part of this idea of thinking about all the forces that are about winners and losers and cooperation and competition and friend and foe, to use the language of my book, is there's so many different aspects of it. And one of the ones that I find most interesting, which I think gets back to what Daniel was sort of thinking about, the safety idea, is this idea called perspective taking. And so this is what I did my dissertation. That was what my dissertation was on back in 1996 to 98, was like sort of on the psychological process of understanding what someone else is experiencing and thinking, and how did that change us. So one of the things I've shown is that people who are good at perspective taking, or you can train them to be better perspective takers, they're less likely to act in prejudicial ways towards other people. They're better at resolving negotiations more effectively. Perspective taking predicts happier marriages, as you said. But after studying perspective taking for 15 years, I now realize there's also a twist to it, which is that when we're in the heat of competition and we're feeling the most sort of animosity towards someone, getting inside their head actually makes us even more competitive, because we think about all the things they might try to do to us, and we try to get back to them against. And so this same psychological process, perspective taking, allows us to be the best friends possible and the best cooperators, can actually exacerbate competition. So I always say perspective taking is the glue that binds people together, but it can be turned into the gasoline that inflames the already existing fires of animosity. You can see that sort of tension coming on up here too.
Yeah, and you could feel some of the perspective taking fading away as some of the emotional currents started becoming more profound.
Yes.
near the end.
Yeah.
And you could almost see, I could almost feel this sort of sympathetic physiological response to what was happening with the characters on stage. They're becoming more and more frustrated with one another. And I guess to me, that's one of the ironies of conflict, that sometimes conflict causes this physiological response, this stress reaction, so we feel like we're under attack. And that response leads us to say stuff and do stuff that ultimately often undermines the relationships that we're worried about in the midst of the conflict.
And you can actually see, when he went to use the bathroom, right, that break, right, you could say, well, the person sitting on stage was upset because they felt rejected or alone, but, this person might have been trying just to down-regulate their arousal that was going to lead them to maybe punch, if there's an anger issue, involved and stuff like that. So you can also see the complicated interaction that occurs. I'm trying to not hurt you by walking out of the room, but yet I can also hurt you by walking out of the room, but I'm trying to protect you, and you can see that complicated thing. One other thing that I wanted to bring up, which is, so Daniel has done amazing work thinking about assertiveness. So how do we know how much to push before we push too far? Are we aware that we're pushing? How do we get feedback that we're pushed too far? And so I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I thought that you could see that happening a little bit up there.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, one of the things is we often don't know that we've pushed too far because we could feel like we won an argument, like we got our way, but ultimately we don't. It's less visible to us the hurt or the pain that we've caused or the relational damage that's the fallout. So someone could take our point and we feel like, I won. I made this claim, I defended it, they gave in, they capitulated. But that sometimes the damage is less visible to us. And so we can go along thinking, I did the right thing, I did what was necessary, I did what was correct, I got my way, I'm a winner. But we don't realize that some of the costs are less obvious and they're maybe cumulative and they're no less real for being maybe less apparent.
Yeah. Another thing that I've done some research on, I thought a lot about is, about stigma, and I've talked about how we reappropriate stigmatizing labels and the psychological process that goes in that. But you mentioned, Abelson's, beliefs as possessions, but in this case it was really scars as possessions, right? Who's got scars? I win if I have the deeper scars that you have. And
right.
You can see this process of, it was a debate or a negotiation of who had suffered more. And I think in the world, we do think that way. How much have I overcome versus how much have you overcome?
Yes.
And where does that happen? And sometimes it's money, sometimes it's love, sometimes it's something else. But you can see that same process of, I'm going to win by having suffered more than you've suffered.
Yeah, a lot of it was about that sort of, the damage and the history and the scars, and also struggling with privilege. Like, how do you cope with privilege? I know, Marcus's character at one point, or maybe it was just Marcus, was talking. It's hard to know. Was talking about just that experience and how do you cope with it, and how do you do the moral thing and the right thing and the ethical thing. And it makes me think of a lot of the work that Adam has done on the feeling of power and that sort of almost intoxicating feeling, which can make it transparent, that you don't realize that you're in that state, but it puts you in a particular mindset that affects your judgments and your behavior.
Yeah. And I think here you could see also there's a sense of, well, you have power because you have more money, but I have power because I can judge you for having more money, right?
Yeah.
There's that sense of, there's a power in the opposite state, right? Which is, I think, it's a psychological sense of power, which really matters, I think. And so you can see that whole process. Any other thoughts? Or I don't know if you want to ask questions.
I'm happy to open it up for discussion. Yeah.
Something I struggle with is over-intellectualization in relationships. So as you're both researchers, and you're talking about being a social psychologist and researching that and being able to walk away from that date or whatever and saying, I'm 95% sure this is
well,
how do you think that intellectualization affects your relationships?
Well, I feel like we should ask Daniel's wife, Amy, or my girlfriend, Jen, and then we could find, because they're both in the audience, so we could find out what they really think. But,
I mean, I don't know if this speaks to over-intellectualization, but I feel like I've personally learned from that literature about conflict, about just how important that is, and tried to take some lessons. I'm sure I'm imperfect at that, but and tried to make them part of my own relationships.
I would say probably using and understanding the research has made me better in relationships in some way, and also made me much more annoying in relationships in other ways, right? Because you could say, well, what you're doing right now is X, Y, and Z. The research shows that it's like, and that's when the baseball bat comes behind you get beaten down and stuff like that. So, but I think we both, Daniel and I both agree that knowledge is power in a lot of ways, and that by understanding things, it gets you closer to being more effective. But you also don't want to ruminate or over intellectualize some things too. I think that is also true.
Have you seen this production more than once?
No.
No. So you have nothing to compare to or to observe the dynamics as they may change.
Yeah. Yeah, or Raphael was saying that it's about 80% scripted, 20% spontaneous, and so I'm curious tonight, what was the percentage that was scripted versus spontaneous?
It's usually about the same.
Okay.
It's usually about the same. Yes, it's usually about the same. I mean,
Pamela
yes.
Anderson every night, or is that?
Pamela Anderson every night.
Okay.
It's like they say scan, couldn't play. But I would say the damage is done, like the real left over the surprise kind of cuts you can make on the outline, but I can make on Marcus or vice versa, is the improv inside the 80% scripted. So
Yeah.
the 80% scripted is scripted, but you can put in a new phrase, you can take a new take on it, you can drive, lift your sentence at the end. There's lots of little tactics inside the scripted stuff that you can really punch on with.
Right.
It's amazing is that there's a kind of agreement that the scripted sections are the scripted sections, that's what they are, and yet there's freedom to do it. It's amazing how the turn of phrase or the extra 3 words can really sting out there, like, because it's like you said this at one point during your talk, I remember, where it's like, because it feels like you're violating the agreement, I'm violating, he's violating the agreement, like, but then that's kind of that's the territory that's actually interesting too.
Have you ever landed a punch at the end, or are you able to?
Not allowed to do.
Okay.
Stick the union on it.
But I squished his hand a bit more today because I wasn't going to stop something else he had done. So I put a lot of sand unless you're going to get squished.
Well, it's funny because I mentioned already that I'm interested in language and like the use of the word "you're a tourist," right? And that in some ways the most biting thing I think the entire play to me was the use of the word tourism because it was a label, and you didn't use as much of the label in reverse, right? It was that one label that tried to diminish you, trap you, and define you in a way, and you can see how that process is. And I think that's how conflict plays out a lot of times is through the selective and strategic use of language. And I thought that was interesting. I also really enjoyed the Tom Cruise. We all do that in relations. Like one little thing you do, and then it gets played out over and over again. It's like I read it on the can once, and So.
I mean, the pacing of the play was also very interesting because it would, peak in its intensity, and then there'd be a break to a different topic, which is sort of necessary for a show that's going to last an hour and a half. Real life conversations, when they're conflict conversations, sometimes they go critical, right? And that's, I think, part of what Gottman talks about is just sort of knowing when you've gone too far, like recognizing that I've pushed your buttons too much and finding a way to walk it back.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means just taking a break or changing the topic or sending a signal, because otherwise in real life it just can get spiraled out of control.
Yeah. And I think that's, Raphael.
I was just going to say, can you guys describe what social psychology is?
I'll take a pass and then you can unpack that. I just think it's kind of what most healthy,
I'll
normal...
mime what he's saying. So.
It's what most normal, healthy adults are doing each day, how we think and feel about ourselves and about others, and how we act, both our own selves and our own judgments, and how we interact with the people around us.
Yeah, and I think it's really about this, dynamic interaction that occurs among people, and I think, Daniel and I both study negotiations, and so negotiations is a really good example of two people interacting, but it's also about how the context. I think one of the single biggest, most important things about social psychology is how our behavior isn't just driven by our personality, but it's really driven by the social context in which we find ourselves. And so, you two have developed on this stage in a way, you've changed as individuals because of that context, also because you're up on stage. And not to embarrass him, but Michael Morris is here. He's one of the world's experts in how does culture, where we come from, affect us? How does the fact that I was born in China affect how I look at how two people interact, or how I think one thing causes another? And Malia Mason is a world famous neuroscientist thinking about how do we make decisions, and how do we resolve some of the conflict in our own mind, and how does our mind wander, and how does that help us solve our goals and pursue our dreams? And so, these are all part of the social psychological tapestry, I guess. And so it's kind of like being in a playground, a gymnasium. Daniel always has this great thing when he gives advice to PhD students going on the job market to give their research talk. He's like, you have to define your, what's your sandbox that you're going to be in today, and you want to keep. So I liked putting the this is our sandbox today. And so, you know, someone asks you a question, you're like, that's another sandbox. We're going to come back to this sandbox. And, but, you know, I feel like we get to play in lots of different sandboxes as social psychologists. So study negotiation, study power, study how people use nicknames or labels like the word tourist and how that affects people, how we compare to each other, how we get inside the head of other people, how, you know, one of the things that, you know, came up a little bit was about social class and thinking about race and gender and how does that inform not just power but also the cultural aspects and the way that those things interact.
Yes, the shared purpose of the show and the context of our relationship in real life might allow us to investigate this question that we, for various reasons, discovered we shared an interest in, and that we're also confused by and aware of in our own lives, and that shared purpose of making it public was something felt worthwhile.
And in creating the piece, we had so many rules in place. We actually got together to try to write a play based on an experience, a friend of ours who had got wrapped up into a pyramid scheme. But it was a self-help pyramid scheme. I don't know, I can't remember the name of the network. It's like a self-help thing, but it's obviously, it ends up being about money and paying into it and buying these books. And we were just curious why this guy at the age of 40 had decided he needed this system to get better, because we assumed he must feel like a loser, like there's something wrong with him at this point. So we got together to try to write a play, like a proper play about Russian novelists trying to write the best novel. And we would play this game as a warm-up. It was a warm-up game just to kind of get our brains going. And we would do it with Russian accents. So it's kind of a clown nose. So we did find that purpose, that we put our Russian accent nose on, and we would start to just yammer at each other. And it allowed us to say whatever we wanted to. And then we sent them to get transcribed. They came back while we were continuing to write this play, and we read the transcription. We said, oh my God, this is so much more interesting. And so we read them without the accents. And we're like, what? You said that? I said that? So that purpose there, we found an artistic sort of attack on this idea of competition, and it was really fruitful.
And you were using Tom Cruise's Russian accent, right?
Well, actually, he was. It's not very good.
Irish
You know, but shared goals, I mean, you know, I teach the core leadership class that all the MBAs take right when they get to Columbia. I'll start teaching next week. And literally the first day of the class is just about the importance of shared goals. And, you know, some of the research on diversity, diverse groups have the best outcomes and the worst outcomes in the world. And the key characteristic that determines whether this diversity goes in one direction or the other is really the shared goal and how much they have some type of superordinate understanding of trying to accomplish something together. And when that breaks down, then the fault lines break, and that's when you get serious conflict and lots of losers. And you know, one thing I just want to say, you know, I found so interesting. I mentioned comparison. You know, there was a sense on stage that you couldn't both be winners. Right, one of you had to be the winner and the other one had to be the loser, and I thought that was sort of an interesting thing. Rather than let's think about how we can both be winners. You know, like George Costanza and Seinfeld. There's some episode of you're all winners when they're running the marathon.
What's the benefit that these two individuals or society in general gets from this dynamic competition?
You mean what we saw, the debate about these issues?
It's just something we engage in all the time with people.
I think there's probably lots of answers to it, but one that occurs to me is, in a sense they were negotiating where they were on these issues, but every one of those conversations is also just a negotiation of who we are to each other. And so it seemed to me like very much that was a negotiation of who they were to each other, whether they could both be winners or whether one had to be the winner and the other had to be the loser. So I think some of the idle chat that we have with, and the, trivial debates that we have with the people who, comprise our days are really negotiations about who we are to each other. And they're often affirmations where we're sort of falling back into the roles of like, that's right, this is who I am for you, and this is who you are for me, and this is all good. Except once in a while that comes into jeopardy, and it can be at risk. I think that's a lot of what we saw were these moments where they weren't happy with who they were making each other be, or who they were with each other. They were sort of like out of equilibrium. So I guess one answer to your question is, we're talking about Pamela Anderson, or we're talking about the Zapatistas. What we're really talking about is who we are to each other.
And it's also, I think your question was also what's the benefit to them and what's the benefit to the audience? And I would probably guess that the benefit is more to the audience than to them. That there was some benefit at some point, I think, for the two of you, but probably, it's just like imagine reliving the same fight with your spouse or your best friend or your, or your colleague day over day over day, right? It would start to wear thin. But I think, for me, I personally loved it, and I think that I was thinking the whole time not just about what's going on stage, but about how I interact with other people, in my life. So how do I interact with Jen, or how do I interact with Daniel, or anyone else? And I think it made me think a lot about the use of language, for example, or when do I try to use my own past scars as a justification or defense, or how can I be more sympathetic? When do I not? And so I think. I would, say that everyone in New York should see this play because I think it'll make them think more deeply about their relationships. Yeah.
Just to follow on that, because I actually think it's a really interesting question, and it's one we've asked ourselves too. Like this impulse, which we feel all the time. Like, what is its kind of benefit? And there's a great kind of Bible in the theater world. Some folks will know is Keith Johnston's Impro, and he does an analysis of the first section about status, and he just takes regular old conversations with folks. And like they're really banal conversations, and does a status transaction analysis on those conversations,
yeah.
and they reveal themselves to be full of that kind of competitive and status kind of, and I do also wonder whether that is like, I know we do it, I know I do it all the time, but like wonder what the benefit is, because we look at, this is one of the things I think you're thinking about a little bit too, is like the zero sum kind of competitive impulse that is in certainly our governance system, and certainly your guys' governance system, and how stuck that is, and how it doesn't produce, in many ways doesn't produce, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious, is it kind of like you're asking, is there an evolutionary benefit, or is there a what is that like that? Have you guys done any research on that? Like, why do we do this? What is the benefit?
I mean, status, first of all, is one of the most important, features of social life, right? It's that, when we have I mentioned the thing where you, lean in or lean out, but I mean, the real thing is that when we have a status hierarchy, it makes conversations go really smoothly because we know where each person stands. And so some person knows that I defer. I know Daniel has more status than me, so I let him speak more awfully. I violate that all the time. But the idea is that we're trying to figure out where we stand with people all the time, because there's so much material, emotional, psychological benefit comes from being respected by other people. And that's, it's people call it sociometric status, being respected by other people. And we want to be respected by other people, but we're fighting, is this going to make me feel respected, or is this actually going to backfire? And there's this almost gymnastics that we go through with ourselves and with other people as we try to negotiate that all the time. But I do think, getting back to Brenna's point, again, awareness of that helps so much. Like if you're aware, like, okay, I know this process happens, here's what I can do to not get too caught up in it, or here's where I can give the respect to the person that they need. And I think why this play is really helpful for people like me or for anyone is that we need periodic reminders of this, right? Because we get back into the thing. So I wonder what it would be like if you did this play, once a month rather than every night for a period of time. What would the effect? It would probably be a much more positive effect on you personally, because you'd come back to it, you'd think about it, you'd go back into your life. But doing it day after day, I gotta imagine it's kind of simple. You're just gonna be like, the last episode, I'm sure there's gonna be a punch through, right?
Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah.
Oh, I just had a question about what you just said, and you said getting respect is for giving respect. When you're in, the lower status in the relationship, is that afforded its own type of respect, or is it only like we want respect as like the big honcho?
No, I mean, I think we can get respect in a variety of different ways. We can get respect at work, we can get respect at home, but what we want is that in the eyes of others, right? That they're looking at me and they see value in me and whatever that value is. And I think that's what we're constantly wanting. So in some cases, you might say, and we have a hierarchy of things that we care more about. So like you might want someone to respect your, your basketball playing because you care much more about basketball than you care about cooking, but someone else might care more about cooking than basketball. And so we want people to respect us on the dimensions that we care more about, and we look for that. And so one of the things is, you can have much more harmonious and smooth interactions if you can figure out what are the things that other people care about that they want to be respected for. If you give people those respect, those people are going to respond in kind with much smoother interactions. And so
I think that's often taken as a mark of a healthy relationship, not just that there's a strict hierarchy applied to it of one person being higher or lower status, but that each person feels affirmed on something that matters to them, and that there may be sort of deferral to that person in that sphere.
Right. It's it's like hierarchy, is basically division of labor, right? Is that it's trying to figure out who can do well, and so what good relationships do is they have a division of labor where each person in the relationship is respected on different dimensions and brings their talents to those dimensions.
On that talented note, Daniel, Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you.